American TV with Mitchell Hadley is the show. I'm Dan Schneider, and now we're going to be talking about Steve Allen, one of the Giants from the early part of the second half of the 20th century. So we just did a show about Ernie Kovacs. A couple of years later, another influential figure appeared in life named Steve Allen, no relation to Woody Allen, no relation to Fred Allen, who we mentioned in the earlier show. What do we need to know about him and why? Well, before I do that, let me just say, for those who don't know Mitch Hadley, Mitch, give a little background about yourself, then we'll go into Allen.
I am an author and classic television historian. I've written about classic TV for 15 years at the website itsabouttv.com. I have written 2 books about classic television. My most recent is called Darkness in Prime Time, How Classic Era TV Foresaw Modern Society's Descent into Hell. If you think that's a mouthful to say, it's also a mouthful to remember, and I'm the one who came up with it. But it is a very interesting book showing how the shows primarily in the 50s and 60s that were born of the Cold War era and born of societal pressures portrayed the kinds of things that we're going through this very day. So you can go to my website, itsabouttv.com, has all the links to the book and all sorts of other neat things. So that's who I am. And I'm proud to be Dan's guest, so that's also who I am.
Well, you've got the name, your name in the title, so Steve Allen. We were talking about Ernie Kovacs and overextending himself, but if there's one person in the 1950s or 60s who probably overextended himself, but in a good way, was probably Steve Allen, because he seemed to be everywhere in those first couple of decades he was around. He was starring The Tonight Show. He was on game shows. His wife, Jane Meadows, was with him on TV specials. He was doing this, that, and the other thing. He played the piano. He seemed to be a modern Renaissance man. Who was Steve Allen, though, to you, if you were to tell a young audience?
When you said he was everywhere, one of the things Steve Allen is the punchline to a very funny skit on Mystery Science Theater 3000, where they play off of precisely that. They have something called the Steve-O-Meter, and in their skit, they prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that everything that has happened in human history was first thought of by Steve Allen. And as they go to, they get the movie sign and go into the theater, they're shouting, "He's everywhere! He's everywhere! He's everywhere!" So that's what reminded me of that. But Steve Allen, Renaissance man. The first host of The Tonight Show, I think that is how many people will think of him. Before there was Johnny, before there was Jack Parr, there was Steve Allen as the first host of The Tonight Show. He was also a panelist, a regular panelist on What's My Line, and in that capacity, he was the man who coined the phrase, "Is it bigger than a bread box?" to ask someone to describe a product that they might have been involved in. He was a songwriter. His biggest hit was a song called "This Could Be the Start of Something Big," which even if you don't recognize it by the title, if you're of a certain age, you'll certainly recognize it having been heard on radio or television. He wrote thousands of songs. He brought people into prominence that they might not have previously been aware of. Jack Kerouac was a guest on one of his shows. Lenny Bruce was a guest on one of his shows. Comedians that wouldn't ordinarily be part of mainstream television, Steve Allen wasn't afraid to introduce them. He wrote a series of best-selling mystery stories that featured he and his wife, Jane, as themselves as celebrities who solved murders in their spare time, murders that they had invariably somehow or other become involved in. So think of Murder, She Wrote. Make the main character a male instead of a female, make him an actual person, make his sidekick an actual person who happens to be his wife, take it out of the Cabot Cove and put it into the world of entertainment, and you've got the Steve Allen books. Steve Allen took, I think, there's no evidence that he and Ernie Kovacs had anything more than perhaps a familial friendship as being part of the same entertainment business. But Steve Allen took many of the absurdities that one has come to associate with Kovacs and introduced them into his work on his various shows. As you say, he was a game show host. He hosted I've Got a Secret while it was on TV. He hosted other programs. He was on the networks. He was in syndication. He became, at the end of his life, an outspoken advocate for better and cleaner television. He was an intellectual. He wrote a show called Meeting of Minds that had figures from history discussing topics as their characters. I mean, I'm just going here and there because it's almost impossible to find something that Steve Allen was not involved in. And we'll get a chance to talk about these in detail. But if you want to know what Steve Allen did, who he was, why we should know who he was, it's almost easier to simply say what wasn't Steve Allen involved in. It would make for a much shorter show, but it would be a whole lot less entertaining at the same time.
Having grown up in the 1970s, Meeting of Minds on PBS was one of the things that most stuck with me. But also, he was a regular on network TV specials. I think he did, a lot of the shows like I don't know, the Johnny Cash kind of stuff. These shows, and he would pop up. I think he did also some of the Dean Martin roasts. So he started out a man of his generation. He started out in radio. Let's pick up his life then. So this would have been during the World War.
Mm-hmm. He started out on radio in Phoenix, later moved to Los Angeles, started working in bigger markets. Like Kovacs, he found that he had a talent for improvisational ad-libbing and humor, and had a very quick mind, which he was able to use with engaging with the audience, being able to quip off of the top of his head, being very engaging in the way that he was able to interact with audiences both on radio and live. He was also very musical, as I say, from a very early age. So music was almost always part of his routine, that he was able to play the piano. He was able to incorporate music into his bits, not just comedic bits, but what he did in general. Probably his first big break was that in 48 to 50, I think it was, he was the host of the Steve Allen Show on CBS Radio. It was a late night show, and you kind of got the first skeletal look at what the Tonight Show was going to be. He did comedy in the form of skits with regular characters. Take the Mighty Carson Art Players. Well, that has its birth in something very similar that Steve Allen used to do with regulars that would appear on his shows. So he did these comedy bits. He also featured musicians and music, both his own music and other singers and performers. He also did interviews. So you see the three major elements of what have come to define late night television and talk shows: music, comedy, and interviews. And that's what we see this being developed on the radio. And we see, again, he's widely regarded as a clever young man, a very sharp young man who can improvise at the flip of a switch, take something in a completely different direction, and had a sense of humor that could be very bizarre and pleasantly unexpected. So it was almost inevitable that kind of talent would translate into something like TV, because again, you're at a point where you're not following the rules, you're making the rules. And he showed an aptitude for being able to improvise, which made him a great interviewer. Just as Carson and Parr were great interviewers because they were comedians. They were able to improvise on the moment based on what situation might have come up, what the guest might have said, take it in an unexpected direction. So it wasn't a surprise that he would graduate to TV. And I suppose, his first big national exposure on TV, he was a local star on television in CBS. He worked for the CBS affiliate, WCBS in New York, and he had a comedy variety show that had a brief run on the network. He was a regular on What's My Line, and he stayed associated with What's My Line and with Goodson Todman for the rest of his professional career. Even though his run on What's My Line was relatively short for a program that was on for 17 and a half years, he was on it for a little less than 3 years. When he left as a regular in 1953. But he was a perfect guest on a show like that because his mind worked very quickly. He was able to follow tangents based on the clues that the contestants were giving him. As I mentioned, he made famous the saying, "Is it bigger than a bread box?" But he was also a wonderfully humorous individual to have on that show, and he played off perfectly from Bennett Cerf and John Daly. But whenever there was a time, I'm fast forwarding here for a moment, but in the big times when What's My Line had momentous occasions, and I'm thinking now of both the death of Fred Allen and later the death of Dorothy Kilgallen, who were longtime fixtures on the show. It was somebody like Steve Allen who came in on the panel and appeared in these shows, which weren't quite tribute shows because they went on with the regular format, albeit in a much more sober manner. But he was considered part of the Goodson Todman family, the What's My Line family, so that when the family pulled together on a dark time, Steve Allen was part of it. When the final episode aired, he'd be part of it. When there was a need on another Goodson Todman show, whether it was I've Got a Secret, which he would go on to host after Gary Moore left, or some of the syndicated shows, he was part of that. So that's, this is the early Allen. This is the Allen who's just come to prominence. And I think that it helps to explain in kind of a haphazard, my generally haphazard way. It kind of goes on to explain where we come to Steve Allen becoming the man who is being talked about on this show right now. It's Steve Allen is the host of The Tonight Show.
My cat Ozzy, who video bombed us, is asking me to ask you about. Apparently, Steve Allen was a wrestling announcer early in his career too.
Yeah, I don't know much about that, but I would think in much the same way as you're looking at a host like Dennis James, who was a very well-known game show host in later years, but who got his start in wrestling, and his catchphrase, mother. It doesn't surprise me at all that Allen could do something like that, because you have to be able to improvise on the spot, and that would have been a perfect medium for him.
So let's talk about The Tonight Show, because most people our age would associate it with Carson and then later Leno. But and I don't know who hosts it now. Even I don't even know. Is one of the
Jimmys?
Is it Kimmel or Fallon?
Fallon.
Fallon. Okay.
Fallon. Kimmel's on ABC.
But as you said,
I think you have to think about that, though. It tells you something, doesn't it?
Yeah. But Allen was the first. How was his original vision different from the later people like the Parrs and the Carsons, and what has remained of Allen?
Well, I think that when I talked about the Steve Allen show on radio, you saw the skeleton for the Steve Allen show on TV, and when the Tonight Show began, it was live, and it was 1 hour and 45 minutes long. It ran from 11:15 p.m. Eastern Time, which is when after the late local news, which at the time in most markets was still just 15 minutes. So it was the first network late night program. It was the child of the great Pat Weaver, one of the most innovative men in the history of television, who wanted to introduce a late night TV show. And you had the Today Show in the morning, you have the Tonight Show in the afternoon, or in the evening, I'm sorry. But the show that Adam came up with to fill an hour and 45 minutes is quite different in some fundamental ways from what you see today. And I'll start with some of the differences. First of all, I talked about the Mighty Carson art players. Well, Steve Allen had a regular series of guests. I don't want to call them guests. They were actually regulars. You had people who appeared with him in skits on a nightly basis. You'd have the Man in the Street interview where you had the Don Knotts, and you had somebody like Louis Nye, or different people like that would be on every show as part of the well, if you look at a show like the Carol Burnett show, where you're talking about Tim Conway and Harvey Korman and Vicki Lawrence, Steve Allen had a regular group of supporting players like that. That's different from future iterations of the Tonight Show, which depended on those things as an occasional feature. He also had regular singers appear on the show, whether it was somebody like Andy Williams or Bill Hayes, or young up-and-coming singers who were developing a reputation. They would be on the show every night, because in variety shows of the time, whether weekly or nightly, that was a standard part of television, is that you had a regular singer, often referred to as a girl singer. Or you would have male and female singers, but they would appear on every show. The most famous, I suppose, on the Tonight Show that Steve Allen had were Steve Lawrence and E. Gourmet. They were his regular singers, and I think that's how they met, actually, and became a couple. But they were regulars on the show, so they were included as part of his regular cast. That is different from the Tonight Show that we came to know and love. And I think that Allen's own participation, while it is not different, it is more frequent than what you would see on a Carson show, for example. Allen is playing the piano, or he's delivering a kind of monologue that isn't necessarily as part of the beginning of the show. It's just kind of appearing during the show. He'll have skits like Carson did with Karnak the Magnificent, or Art Fern, or reading letters from the editor. That was a regular feature of the show, but it also highlighted Allen's appearance in there, Allen's talent. The Tonight Show, the first Tonight Show, really is the Steve Allen show. And so Allen is even, if it's even possible, is a much bigger part of the show than Carson or Parr would be. So I think those are some of the major differences. But what you do have throughout that is the variety. You have Allen interviewing people, so you have guests coming on the show to promote things. You have the interaction between Allen and the guests. You have the makings of the talk show. Now, I think Conan O'Brien has said that he regards Steve Allen as the father of the modern day talk show. I don't quite agree with that. I agree that Allen played a huge role in the talk show. But if you want to look at what the Tonight Show became, I think it's more appropriate, it's more accurate to say that what Allen developed was an hour and 45-minute comedy variety program that was outstanding in its time slot and unprecedented. I think you've got to really go to Allen's natural successor, Jack Paar, to say that this is where the talk show started, because even though Paar retained some of the elements of Allen's format, for Paar the emphasis was much more on talk and conversation than it was with Allen. So I don't agree that Allen was the father of was the actual father of the Tonight Show, except that he was the first host. But he absolutely gave us the broad outlines of what the Tonight Show would become, and Parr filled in the outlines. Then Carson filled them in a bit more. And I don't know if any of the hosts in subsequent years have really done anything to add to it. They've done more to detract from it. But they're all playing with the same toolkit that those three men developed.
Well, we'll have to talk about Jack Parr at another time, but it seems to me that Allen started what might in Britain be called the chat show, which is different than a talk show. The chat show is more celebrity, it's lighter, whereas Parr, arguably along with David Susskind, started the talk show, which was in depth, which led to the Phil Donahues and the Tom Snyders, and that seems to have vanished from all television. Maybe there are some local PBS shows, but the chat show that he had originated remains.
Yeah, I think one of the things you can add about today's hosts, and I don't want to turn this into a dump on late night television, but Allen was so incredibly talented at everything that he did that he could carry a show like that for an hour and 45 minutes as a personality host. And I think that's one of the things you don't see in the shows today. They may incorporate the features of the chat show like Allen did, but they don't have the talents to do it. And I'm not sure who could.
I just pick up on what you said about that book when we were off. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a book back on the shelf behind me called Inventing Late Night, and forgive me, I can't remember who the author is at the moment, but that picks up on some of the things that we've talked about, that unquestionably, whether or not you credit Parr or Carson with refining the format into the talk show. If you want to look at the late night variety chat show format, the late night show, that is Steve Allen. He did invent late night television on a national basis. You can see it in local programming. I mean, Chicago had a program that ran late night where you'd interview a local personality was interviewing celebrities. You've had variations on that again in local TV, which doesn't exist anymore, with movie hosts even would interview Hollywood celebrities. But if you're talking about the outline of the Tonight Show of late night television, yeah, I think that Allen invented it.
Well, despite his cultural ubiquity in that era, he never seemed to be someone who reached the level of superstardom the way Lucille Ball did, the way Jackie Gleason did. His show, the variety show, could never knock Ed Sullivan off of his perch. So talk about that, in that he was ubiquitous, but he was never a supernova.
Well, I think you start at exactly the right point. Allen gave up the Tonight Show to host a 1-hour variety show that NBC put on opposite Ed Sullivan. It was the successor to the Colgate Comedy Hour, which had run for several years with a rotating group of hosts, the most famous of which were Martin and Lewis. But for a while, I think there was every evidence that Allen might have even considered making a go of it and keeping both shows at the same time, the Tonight Show and the Steve Allen Show. But NBC needed someone to go up against Sullivan, as counter programming. Now, Allen and Sullivan got along very well together, unlike some of the feuds that Sullivan would get into. Allen never pretended that his goal was to knock Sullivan off the air or to become the ratings giant. Allen presented him as an alternative, or to augment Sullivan's show, to provide even more entertainment. But he never saw himself as a challenger to Sullivan. That could be, in a way, why Allen's prime time show didn't take off more, because he didn't try to challenge Sullivan. But now to take from that and to carry over your point, yes, Allen was ubiquitous, but unlike Sullivan or unlike someone like Jackie Gleason, he was never, after the Tonight Show, identified strictly with one kind of programming. He was identified with variety shows and talk shows, but, he started another talk show, another late night show, around the time that Carson came to the Tonight Show. You can read some accounts in TV Guide of rumors that when Parr left the Tonight Show, that Allen had made a pitch to come back and reclaim the Tonight Show. You can also see evidence that Parr started his that Allen started his syndicated program, which was sponsored by Westinghouse, that he started that as a late night show in the event that Carson turned out not to be a success on the Tonight Show. So while he wasn't directly challenging Carson, he was positioning himself as an alternative to take advantage of Carson and Bond. And in truth, Parr had been a big star. Nobody knew how Carson was going to turn out. He wasn't an unknown quantity, but nobody knew. Well, of course, as we know, he became a huge thing. And so Allen didn't need to continue to position himself as a reserve option. So then you see him going from one kind of show to another. You see him replicating this comedy variety format in a daytime show that is syndicated. You see him popping up as the host of I've Got a Secret after Gary Moore left CBS. Gary Moore had hosted I've Got a Secret from the start. But when he took a step back from television for various reasons that maybe someday we'll go into, Steve Allen became the host of that. Didn't seem to be a good fit. It really wasn't, because Gary Moore understood that the purpose of being a game show host was to make the panelists and the guests look good. Steve Allen felt that the purpose of the show was to make Steve Allen look good. I don't say that as a knock, although Steve Allen had as healthy an ego as anybody. It just, that isn't the way those shows work, and it didn't work really in the long run on I've Got a Secret or on any of the other game shows that he might appear on as a host. But he goes on to host summer replacement shows, the Steve Allen Comedy Hour. He goes on to become, as you said, and you couldn't say it any better, a ubiquitous presence. But with the exception of one program that he does late in his career, he's not closely identified with any of them. He's identified with the genre, but not with the program. And so besides the Tonight Show, he doesn't have the Honeymooners. He doesn't have the Jackie Gleason Show, the American Scene magazine. He doesn't have the other things that other stars become so tightly identified with. We talked about Lucy. You've got the succession of Lucy shows. He doesn't have that. He only has one other show that really becomes closely identified with him, which we'll talk about. But I think that may account for why he is not better remembered. You mentioned at the outset that he spread himself thin. And he did. He was entirely capable of doing that, however. And so I think that he just could do so many things that sometimes it is better to be a master of one trade than a master of all. He really wasn't a jack of all trades. He was a near master of most trades. And if he had concentrated on one or two things, maybe he would be more famous today. But it doesn't diminish the greatness of what he accomplished.
So I was reading, and it's interesting because we mentioned Meeting of Minds in the 1970s on PBS, but apparently he started that in the 60s in the Westinghouse show, and they wanted
Yeah.
him to not do it, and that was one of the reasons he left that project.
Exactly. Even in the '60s, and the Westinghouse show, he had done a what could be called a backdoor pilot version of Meeting of Minds. And for anybody who has not seen Meeting of Minds, I'll try to explain it as briefly as I can. It was a roundtable discussion that Ammon, as the moderator, as himself, would host, featuring actors and actresses portraying various figures from history. You might have Thomas Aquinas. You might have Galileo. You might have Rembrandt. You might have Teddy Roosevelt. You might have Joan of Arc. You'd have all these different characters from different times in history. And ideally, in a classic episode of Meeting of Minds, you would have characters who did not overlap, but in most cases were aware of the other characters and could speak somewhat to their philosophy, but they would discuss the issues of the day from the perspective of their time. And it was an intellectually stimulating show, but it was also accessible to the public, to the viewers. And Alan was the man behind it because it was this phenomenal curiosity and knowledge that he had that drove him to raise these questions and to look into different things. And, to the extent that he was able to steer the direction that the show would go in and steer the conversation. It was really a perfect match for him. And when I talk about Alan's later career, and I was kind of teasing this and talking about how there was only one show after the Tonight Show that he really became known for, this is it. I think that if you were to talk to anybody from the '70s on, and if you had a shot at them recognizing Steve Allen for anything other than the Tonight Show, it would be Meeting of Minds. It's unfortunate that it isn't more readily available. You can't go on YouTube and find a lot about it. You can find the first episode, but most of the Meeting of Minds stories, if you will, were 2 hours long. They were presented in two one-part episodes, and they would just simply continue from the first part into the second part. And it is very, very difficult to find Meeting of Minds to watch unless you are willing to pay a lot of money and go deep to find it somewhere. And that's too bad.
Uh, the thing about the Westinghouse show not wanting it, I think this was around the same era when Newt Minow famously called TV a
Yeah.
vast wasteland, and
Mm-hmm.
here's someone wanting to go counter to that or to present them something, and is shot down by the very sponsor of the
Yep.
show.
Yeah, it's hard. It is only surprising in the sense that Alan used the Westinghouse show for so many creative things. I think it was the Westinghouse show that he did part of the show from atop a flagpole or a tower of some kind, and they had constructed a platform on there, and he's up there, and he's got his piano up there, and he's doing the show literally from the top of a flagpole. And he did so many creative things on Westinghouse and on the Steve Allen Plymouth show, where I just briefly mentioned that he would have somebody like Jack Kerouac reciting his poetry while Allen played the piano to accompany it. It is unfortunate that they didn't take a chance on something like Meeting of Minds. It's not again, though, it's not surprising only in that it's surprising only to the extent that there were so many other neat things that he did on that it's too bad they wouldn't let him do that as well.
If you want to look at it, because I remember some of the episodes, what was sort of talk shows. Other times they'd be moving around as if they were in a French ballroom. Other times they would be sitting down. Probably the only take on the talk show format that was as innovative, if not as deep, was the much later Space Ghost Coast to Coast, which sort of
Yeah.
inverted that, in that Alan is playing himself, talking to historical people, whereas that show took a fictional character, Space Ghost, and made him as if he was a real character.
Mhm.
So it's almost a mirror image.
Yeah, the only other show that's like that, I would think, would be the Larry Sanders Show, and that would have been only if you had only shown the Sanders Show and not shown Larry's backstage life. But if you could imagine the Larry Sanders Show as just a half an hour talk show, that would have been kind of the same thing, or maybe America Tonight.
Just a minor point. He's one of these people that's associated with an odd nickname, Steve Areno. Do you know where
Hmm.
that came from? Because that was early in his career somewhere it came from.
I don't know what the genesis was of that, unless. And as I always say, two things I say to people who are relying on me for expertise. Number one, my skill is worth what you pay for it, which in this case is nothing. And number two, I'm almost always positive that there's somebody out there who might be able to answer a question that I can't. The earliest reference I can recall to it is the Louis Nye Man on the Street interview, where he would say, "Hi ho, Steve Areno." And I don't know if he coined that or if it comes from someplace else, but that I think is certainly where it became most popular.
So, one of the few things I remember from his latter half of his career by the 1980s was that he was in a remake of The War of the Worlds. He played the part that Orson Welles did 50 years on. Do you recall that? Or
I don't, but that doesn't surprise me again that he would be involved in something like that. That's a very interesting take, but that is not something I have had the opportunity to see or be involved listening to.
So I do want to talk briefly about his career as a composer, because looking at it, there were thousands of pieces, but it looks like some of the most successful stuff was sort of what you might call quirky songs, or he also did jingles for
Hmm.
advertisement. What was his role in that, and is he seen as somehow a pioneer in jingle writing or anything like that?
Yeah, I think that probably, what he's most known for would be a couple of things, I think. One of them is, I mentioned this at the outset, this could be the start of something big, which was his theme song, and it was really a big hit. But, when he would do conceptual things, whether I'm thinking perhaps of some of the jazz work that he did in conjunction with poems, where he would work to the rhythm of a beat writer. I think that showed just how creative a talent he was in there. But my main takeaway from him with the music is just the sheer prolific nature of his talent of writing over 1,000 songs. Uh, and I think there's an anecdote that might seem to go a little astray that demonstrates that, but I think it's significant that he and Jane Meadows were presenters on the Academy Awards one year. Uh, and he was not a stranger to movies. He played Benny Goodman in the Benny Goodman Story, so he had acted in the big screen. But he and Jane are presenting an Oscar, and they're doing it in the musical categories. They're not doing it in any kind of acting or writing. They're presenting the best song and the best score Oscars. So even in that sense, he has such a strong identification with music. And he makes a joke in the Oscar appearance on there. The winner of the Oscar that year was Nikos Kazantzakis, I think, Never on Sunday, and he's not there to accept the award. And nobody had told them that he wouldn't be there, and no, and the person who was supposed to accept in his absence doesn't get up there to accept it. So they're kind of left standing there, he and Jane. And Steve makes a joke about it that maybe he's not here because it isn't Sunday. And then he goes on to say, well, I'll just write a song myself. The idea that while we're waiting for somebody to pick up the Oscar, I'll just write this song. But I think that he would be recognized as a talent in any kind of songwriting. I don't have a lot of the knowledge on the jingle parts of it, but would it surprise me? No. You probably know more than I do on that score.
Wanted to talk about a couple of other things that he's noted for outside of television, just to work it back in. He did also have a career as an author. Mainly, he wrote books that were annotations. He was sort of like Isaac Asimov. I remember he had an annotated Bible and things like that. Did anything there that he wrote, does it stick out as you as being important or anything?
Perhaps not a single title, but I think it was overall in those kinds of books, leaving aside the novels that he wrote, in those kinds of books, I think that it showed his overall inquisitiveness. As I mentioned, that he was a very curious man, curious about things, and inquisitive about ideas. And he was not a religious man. I don't know if he was technically an atheist or an agnostic, but he was never afraid to engage on those kinds of ideas. And I think in all the books that he either annotated or collections that he might have forwarded or collected, he was always showing that intellectual curiosity and a willingness to engage on an issue. In ways that sadly today we don't see people quite as willing to do. I don't know that there was ever an idea that Allen saw or encountered that didn't make him curious or that he wasn't excited about getting into. So I would, Dummeth, I suppose, is the book that that comes to mind right away. The idea about examining the intelligence of people. Why aren't we as smart as we used to be? Why aren't we as curious as we used to be? Why have our standards gone down? And engaging this and challenging it. So I take it back. That is the one nonfiction book that I first think of when I think of him.
He also later in his career, I remember a couple of episodes on, I think it was Johnny Carson or it might have been Dick Cavett. He took up the mantle of a scientific skeptic too, and he did a couple of shows where he took on people like Uri Geller, the way that James Randi, the magician, did. And he wrote a number of books about skepticism and that kind of thing. Have you ever seen any of those clips?
I have, yes, and I think that what I find so refreshing about it in his willingness to challenge it and engage on these ideas. One of the things that I think is interesting about Allen there is that whether or not you agreed with him, you always had the feeling that he, number one, took the issue seriously, and number two, came well prepared. And I think that in acting as a skeptic, and he was also a religious skeptic, as I suggested, he was not the kind of a man who was inclined to simply take it for granted that something had to be the way it was. And whether he was using science as a tool of logic or science as something that required logic to look at it and challenge it, I think that he was always refreshing like that. Again, I think it's part of that example. You never knew which Steve Allen you were going to get. He could be so many different people. But he was great at being able to challenge people like that because it showed, and I keep making this point, but it showed that he wasn't afraid to engage on the level of ideas that he felt were worth discussing.
In that vein, I do remember in the late 1980s when Howard Stern became well known around the country as a shock jock, and Don Imus too,
Mm-hmm.
that Steve Allen was highly critical of them. And I remember he would be ridiculed by Stern, uh, basically that, oh, you know, he didn't change with the times.
Mm-hmm.
What was your take on that their rather public feud?
Well, I think that part of it was that Allen had. I think to suggest that he couldn't change with the times was absurd. As a man who is as well read and as stimulated by intellectual argument as Allen was, certainly to suggest that he couldn't change with the times is ridiculous. Um, if he did not change with the times, it would be because he didn't want to change with the times. Because he felt the times didn't require changing. And I think if you look at his overall career, the idea that he stayed static is a stupid one. He was always moving. I think that what bothered somebody like Stern is that Allen didn't fall for his shtick. And what outraged Stern and other political liberals in the last years of Allen's life was that he wasn't afraid to form a coalition with social conservatives over attacking what they felt was crudity and a socially degrading content of television. Now, if you like Stern kind of rely on that kind of thing in order to make your career, of course you're going to think that Allen isn't a man of the times. But I would challenge you to say that a man who could champion Lenny Bruce and a man who could do an album with Jack Kerouac, to say that someone like that can't keep up with the times and I'll be frank about it, that's just to demonstrate to the public how stupid you are. On a good day, Steve Allen would forget more between breakfast and lunch than someone like Howard Stern would ever hope to know during his entire life. But I will point out this aspect, and again, I will say that considering the times we live in and some of the events that have just happened, which I'm not going to delve into, but except to make the point that Steve Allen, who is a liberal Democrat, formed a coalition with Brent Bozell and his group that was trying to reform the content of television. Now, Brent Bozell, if you don't know who he was I believe, William F. Buckley Jr. Well, the original Brent Bozell was Buckley's brother-in-law and was involved with National Review. L. Brent Bozell III, who I think is the Bozell that Allen worked with, was either the son or the grandson of the original Bozell. I think the son. But my point is that Allen was not afraid to form a coalition with someone who is diametrically opposed to him politically if he felt that there was an issue that they had common ground on that served the public need and which they, working together, could present to the public in hopes of finding areas of agreement. That is something you don't see a lot today. There may be one side who is more prone to that kind of thing than the other, but you don't see many people like Steve Allen who are willing to engage in that kind of conversation, and you see even fewer people who are willing to give credit to the people like Steve Allen. So I think that using Stern as a measurement against that, I think Stern is the one who winds up coming out short-sighted and not willing to change with the times, because Stern follows the idea that change is inevitable, ergo get used to it. He would have been a great proponent of who moved my cheese. Allen would have been the proponent of is that change as a concept is always inevitable, but every aspect of change has to be challenged critically to be shown that it is necessary.
So, one of the things we should talk about Steve Allen is his wife Jane Meadows, because the
Mm-hmm.
50s, 60s, 70s was certainly an era of celebrity couples, much more so than today. Because I guess a lot of people don't get married as much as anymore. I guess,
Yeah, or
but
don't stay married.
yeah,
Yeah.
the biggest one of the last 20 years, I guess, was Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt. But you had Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz. You had uh, Paul Newman and what's her name? What's
Joanne Woodward.
Joanne Woodward, yeah. And uh, in that era, if you said Steve Allen, Jane Meadows followed.
Yep.
And maybe after those two I mentioned and one or two others, they were known almost as a couple. They did Meeting of the
Yes.
Minds together and whatnot. So talk a little bit about who she was and her influence on him as an artist and man.
And Jane Meadows was she and her sister Audrey Meadows, who was the original Alice on the Honeymooners, were both actresses, both known when they got to know Steve, and Steve Allen eventually wound up divorcing his first wife and marrying Jane, but I think Jane was a perfect complement to him in being able to play off of what of his quick wit and his musical talent and skill. And I think that she, was a steadying influence on him in some ways. I think she was a perfect partner for him in many ways because um, she could appear with him and she could be part of an act of two people who were incredibly talented in their own rights individually. Jane was a fine actress. She was could do drama and comedy, and she was great on game shows. She was an original panelist on I've Got a Secret Herself. And whether they appeared together or separately, they were great talents. But together, they did play off of each other so well. And she was as quick as he was in many respects, and could play off of that. And I think that I like to think that she did kind of have a grounding influence on him in some ways, but I don't really know exactly what some of the things were involved in their relationship, but I do know that it lasted until his death, and I think that she was dedicated to making sure that his legacy would continue.
And speaking of his death, just like with Kovacs, he was involved in a car crash. But from what I'm reading, it was thought not to have been a minor, or not to have been a major crash, but
Mm-hmm.
he sustained enough injuries that at his age, near 80 at the time, he just sort of expired in his sleep later that day.
Yeah, I know that at least in one source that I've read, his official cause of death is considered a heart attack.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right. He would have been involved in an extremely minor accident, a fender bender, and I think that it had involved contact between him and the steering wheel. So
Mm-hmm.
you're talking about some internal injuries in the area of the chest that were caused by this. It wasn't anything he thought was particularly significant. He got out of the car, joked with the people who had the accident, probably even signed autographs or something like that. But yeah, after it was all over, he was tired, went to lay down, fell asleep, never woke up.
Uh,
Very sad.
so let's talk about his legacy. Obviously, in the talk show genre, or the chats show version of that, he's big. Where is his biggest legacy, if not that?
I think probably his biggest single legacy to most people is late night TV, the Tonight Show specifically, but late night in general. And so I think that's where his lasting single legacy is. I think overall his legacy rests as a man who was eternally impatient to look at something new and different and to be intellectually curious. And he is a very good companion to Kovacs in the sense that although we're talking about different kinds of creativity, we're talking about two men who are incredibly different, who were looking to stretch the boundaries of television beyond what was conventional at the time, and who weren't afraid to go into areas that other people hadn't gone into in hopes that they might be able to do something with it. So if someone were to ask me about Allen's legacy, I would use the term that you used at the beginning, a Renaissance man who seemed to be able to do everything. But I think that his lasting legacy will probably having as the title of that book, Inventing Prime Time. I think that's what people will always know and love him for.
Well, on that note, we'll end this show. We'll be back next month with some more goodies on American television history. Thanks, Mitch.
Looking forward to it.